Hello and welcome to the Las Vegas Jewish Film Festival. My name is Neil Popish. I am the program director with the Jewish Community Center, a division of Jewish Nevada. Special thanks to the Robinson and Frankoff families for their sponsorship and dedication to Jewish film. I'd also like to thank Joshua Abbey and the Las Vegas Jewish Film Festival for their wonderful partnership. We'd like to also thank the Las Vegas Review Journal and all of our sponsors on the screen and all of our producers that are listed on your screen. We hope that you have enjoyed our series of films and webinars. Please visit the Las Vegas Jewish Film Festival website at www.lvjff.org for updates and links to past webinars. I'd like to now introduce our panelists. We are honored to welcome Danny Lyon, a photographer and filmmaker. After being accepted as the photographer for Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC, pronounced SNCC, known as SNCC, Mr. Lyon was present at almost all of the major historical events during the Civil Rights Movement. Also joining us, as always, is Las Vegas Jewish Film Festival Director, Joshua Abbey.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Neil. And welcome, Danny. May I call you Danny instead of Mr. Lyon?
Sure. Hi, Josh. Good to see you.
And Neil neglected to include your credit as a writer as well. I know you're a filmmaker, photographer, a writer, and in my opinion, a legend of contemporary culture. So it's really an honor to have you participate in our little Jewish Film Festival in Las Vegas and talk about your remarkable accomplishment with this new project called SNCC, which I understand played at the Whitney Museum, first at San Francisco Modern, and then at the Whitney. The new Whitney in New York. Where else have you shown it publicly?
Well, it's a long, ugly story, but yeah, I've been, when I made film, Josh, I went back to things I did over 50 years ago, and I was thinking about this interview and the history involved. So this would be like you interviewing someone who was in World War II I think in 2005. And of course that would be an older, and there were plenty of people around in 2005, but there were also concentration camp survivors. But they would have been old. So the subject of the film is really the distant past. And to do it, I went back to work I did when I was very young. I was 20, 21 years old. And that's how I made the film. And I thought as I made it, the Black Lives Movement really exploded. And I just worked furiously every day sitting at these computers. I said, I got to finish this film because Netflix will grab it. The kids in the street will see it. And I imagine like in the French Revolution, that'll just urge them up over the barricades. And of course, Netflix turned it down, Hulu turned it down, Amazon turned it, they all turned it down. And so I was crestfallen, and I went to the Whitney, and being an art museum, they showed it, but now this will be one of the first times it's ever shown. Actually, it's shown here and there. I made it public on Vimeo. I made it free on Vimeo for a while, but we're entering all these different festivals now, hoping to get it out to a bigger audience.
Well, it's certainly timely and I would say essential. Are you saying that the Black Lives Matter, I mean, you knew you wanted to do it before Black Lives Matter, the recent demonstrations, erupted. What was the catalyst that just said, okay, it's time to do this now?
Well, I began filming John Lewis 13 years ago. primarily because I had access to John Lewis. So we had been roommates when we were very, very young, and we remained close. He visited this house when he was the head of Vista. When I lived upstate, he visited there. We kept in touch. I'd been in touch with his wife. And of course, John became more and more famous the older he got and as time went by. I'm really into history. I studied history at the University of Chicago. Bernie Sanders was a classmate of mine, and we remained friendly. And I met Bernie, John Lewis, and Mark DeSuvero, who's one of our greatest living sculptors, all in the same year when I was 20. So all you 20-year-olds out there, get out there and do something with your lives, because this is the moment that will change everything. So, and that was 1962. Anyway, because I knew John and I thought, well, John's a big shot. I'll make a film about John. And then I went with him to the convention that nominated Obama for the first time in Denver. And that's where the film began. And over the years, I made different trips to see John. And then I decided John was boring as a subject. Or as one of the slick people said, oh, John, he says the same thing all the time. Even his cell phone has this, keep your eyes on the prize, you know. So I thought, well, I need more material, you know, and I did two things. One is I started filming other SNCC people, which was always an ambition of mine, because I was one of them and they were my friends. And I filmed Julian Bond. And then as I started putting it together, I decided to scan all my negatives. So I had made pictures, some of which became famous immediately. But for every really good photograph you make hundreds that no one is interested in, including me. It's the nature of it. You know, roll of film has 35 pictures on it, or mine did. And you're lucky if you have one really good picture every roll. So that leaves 35 others. So I literally had thousands of negatives and pictures that had never been published and never been looked at. So scanning did not exist in 1962. It didn't exist in 1982. And so I went to a little Chinese lab and I scanned everything and had them all and started working with them. And at that point, I got intrigued by finding audio that might have survived from that time. That's a whole nother story. But so it's what's called a compilation film. You know, there have been many films about the Holocaust. And Shoah, which is the greatest of them, has no old footage in it, zero. Shoah doesn't have a single photograph even from the time, though photographs do exist, of the Holocaust. Very few, but Shoah intentionally was entirely done through interviews of people. So that's one way to make a film. But I think there are many others that were made from old footage. I forgot the names. I think Marcel Office made one. So these are different ways to make historical films. And this film uses all these different methods, but it is what they call a compilation film, I think, which is made out of all these different elements. I think the most interesting elements are the audio, because audio survived that was recorded in the churches in 1963 of these figures. And when you hear them speak, you're really, it's not that you're taking back to the moment, you're in the moment. And because of that, I think it's a very powerful thing to experience.
Well, the timing was obviously very fortuitous in that a lot of your subjects passed on. Not too long after you were able to capture.
I filmed, my first film was about a tattoo artist who was an alcoholic. It's actually a very funny film. Some people think it's my best film. It's called Social 127. All of my films are free on Vimeo, meaning if you Google my name and then put Vimeo or films, you should find them, and you can look at any of them, including a 5-minute version of this film. But so anyway, I made the film about the tattoo guy, and about a year later, he died. And then I filmed someone else and they died. And I started thinking that maybe there was a connection, that there was some kind of a, you know, like a voodoo thing going on where it was bad luck. And I got afraid to film my good friends. But that's an, yeah, but it's awful. Julian died. And then John got sick right in the middle. You know, he was in the midst of the film, and which is a disaster, especially for John, but really for all of us. But you're right about Black Lives Matter. Suddenly this thing exploded, and I thought, wow, this story of SNCC, the story of students who create a successful uprising, a grassroots uprising that they're central to, is exactly what's going on now. I thought this was an uprising that was going on, and it had very many SNCC-like things. It was led by African Americans. It was highly integrated, and it was a grassroots event. They're really, you know, they say, oh, so-and-so started. There is no leadership. And I think that was very true in the Southern Civil Rights Movement, this event that I witnessed.
I think the interesting difference is that the resistance to the Black Lives Matter movement is a lot more subversive than the resistance that you documented in the Deep South, of course. I love the music. How did you select the gospel choices that you made? Because they're so perfect for the story and to complement the imagery. Were you familiar with those songs for a long time, or?
Well, so I'm a kid, and I'm down in Atlanta. I live with John. I'm part of SNCC, and my job is to run around and make these. But no one else was doing this, by the way. It simply was a different world. Of course, there were no iPhones. There were no cell phones, and you know, there just weren't hundreds of cameras at these events. Many of the things I photographed, there were no cameras, but there were local news people. I think it would be a local news event, especially if there be a lot of arrests or any kind of violence. But and of course, I was alone with SNCC people all the time in all kinds of non-news events. But halfway through, I'd been around about a year, and another Jewish fellow named Alan Ribeck came down from Chicago, and he had a very bad limp. He must have been a polio victim or something. He often didn't even use a cane. He would just stagger when he'd walk. But he was, you know, again, I was 21, so he was probably in his 40s. He was older, and he brought a Nagra, you know, the big Nagra 4, these big ones. And he also brought a professional audio guy who was an old friend of mine from the University from Chicago, Bob McNamara. And I remember in Selma, Alabama, which was Selma about 18 months before the notorious incident where John almost was killed. And there was a huge movement SNCC had created in Selma. And there was a big church. It was a big Baptist church. It's just crammed with, you know, African Americans, you know, older people, older women, high school kids, children. They were just packed, and they were often very hot. These churches. It was summertime, and in this case, there were police outside. Meaning, sometimes you were afraid to leave the church, that they'd be just arresting everyone or doing something horrible. And singing was always a huge part of the civil rights movement. And Ribeck hung microphones the way they do in Carnegie Hall. So he was really into making a professional stereo recordings, and I remember him doing that. And when I left the movement and time went on, he issued a record called Movement Soul, which is still out there. And I always had that record because my photograph was on the cover. My photographs were all over. And it was an editing of everything he had done. And I kept thinking, what happened to the rest of this guy's recordings? Because I knew he was all over the place. And I got fixated on James Foreman. Foreman was like a father to me. He really created SNCC. He was little older. John said he was like a general. So if Slick was all these 18-year-olds and 20-year-olds, Foreman was probably 40. He was executive secretary. He really ran SNCC. He kind of picked John, he used John, and he was the boss. And I was really, I had heard him, I remembered how he spoke, and I thought, God, I would like to get more audio of Foreman. And anyway, after a long hunt, I found his recordings. I mean, there's an archive, I was able to find it. And he had left hundreds of tape recordings, some of which were digitalized. And I was able to get them, and that's the source of most of that. Not all, some of it's from, commercial Folkways Records, it's their credited. But he's really responsible for these crystal clear recordings often of the music. And you're right, the music really, I mean, looking at a bunch of stills, it's pretty boring. You want to keep it moving, but you get to this music, and then cutting it to music was so much fun too, because of the rhythms and everything. And the photographs go by very quickly. I don't measure them in seconds, but they're probably on there for less than seconds. There are hundreds and hundreds of photographs. But the whole attempt is through all of this to somehow place you inside these churches and in these meetings.
I mean, one of the things that struck me the most about the film was how a still image can be much more powerful than the moving image. Compared to a lot of documentary film taken during the movement, your still photographs just are much more incisive, much more in touch with that reality. They're masterfully achieved, and to see them breathe, in the context of the film, I think works really, really well. Let me just ask you a little bit about your Jewish upbringing, since we're in a Jewish film festival here. And how did your Jewish heritage and your upbringing inform your values, your life perspective? And I'm assuming that motivated some of your interest in fighting oppression and joining movements such as the Civil Rights Movement.
I don't know that had you asked me that question when I was 20 or 21, I probably would have kind of rolled my eyes at you like, what's with this dude, boy, is he out of it. And I remember when I came to Albuquerque, which would have been in the 70s, a fellow who was very important at the UNM, who's passed away, he was head of photography. And he wrote a piece about me. And by then I had done the bike riders and done the prison, done these other projects. And he said, oh, Danny Lyon, he's a New York Jew is what he is. And that explains everything. And I was so angry about this that I actually called the editor and said, you better not publish that. And of course, he never spoke to me again. Well, he did speak to me just before he died. I was nice to him, but I was kind of horrified at that, which is that's interesting in itself. Who wants to be known as Jewish and all of that stuff. So in fact, we were not an Orthodox family. I was not bar mitzvahed. My mother considered herself a modern person, but she came from Russia when she was 15. But she had this whole family that was older. There were Russian immigrants. I was delivered by my uncle, who came here at 16 or 17. So those were the Russians, and they were also very smart. One of my cousins was a tri-state chess champion. Try doing that. Another cousin, these are first cousins, helped build the atomic bomb because he was a student of Einstein. Try doing that. He was a physicist, and my father was a doctor. He was a German. In fact, my mother's family called him the German because he was alone at the table, which was pretty funny. He thought they were idiots because their photographs were all out of focus. He was a really good photographer. So it was like the soul came from one group of Jews and the brains came from another. I mean, this is how people talked to each other back then. they also didn't get along. You know, Eastern and German and Eastern. I mean, the reason this is all fresh in my mind. I've been writing a memoir, and one of the things that happens in my memoir is my father's a doctor in New York. He's just in 1934. Everybody came here. You know, Henry Kissinger came here. Hans Morgenthau came here. My father came here. They all left, and they came here, and he was on the roof of the Beth Israel Hospital, which is still standing on 2nd Avenue in New York at 15th Street. The doctors would have tea and coffee on the roof. And he told another doctor he was marrying a Russian Jew. And the other doctor said, oh, these Russian Jews, they're all pigs. And my father slapped him. So, I mean, these are crazy Jews fighting with each other. So that's the background I came up. I asked John Lewis that question about Blacks and Jews, and he gave me a fascinating answer. One of the things John said, which I didn't know, was when this great wave of Jewish immigration happened, including many intellectuals and teachers, that they couldn't get hired in a lot of Eastern schools. And they went south and taught in Southern Black schools because it's the only place they could get a job. And John named one of his teachers in Nashville, who was a Jewish immigrant in a Black school, that he remembered him, and that guy had in the back. So that's yet another, connection between these two groups. I think it's endless. I mean, you can look back historically. The truth is, there were, SNCC was a Black organization, and this was a Black uprising. But it did have white members, and a lot of those white members were Jewish, not all of them. And of course, when Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner were murdered, lynched, taken in the woods and murdered, one of them was a local Black boy from Mississippi. His best friend was a New York Jew who died. They died in each other's arms. And the other boy was Andy Goodman, who was also Jewish from New York, from the Goodman family.
It strikes me that there really weren't that many. I mean, the original group was 11, and then they're up to 300 participating freedom riders. It seems like a relatively small number who actually had the guts to, stand up for their beliefs and their threshold of injustice and get down there and do the hard labor of protesting Jim Crow.
Well, that was more suicidal than hard labor, what they did. But just to be clear, I was not on the freedom rides, and they say during revolutions, a period of revolution, time is compressed, and things happen very quickly. This was true in the French Revolution. It was, of course, true in the American Civil War also, and it was true during the Southern Civil Rights Movement. And the freedom rides happened very, very early, and they're planned out in Nashville by Diane Nash, and I think there were 2 buses with 10, so there would have been 20 people on the original freedom ride. Then they blew up the buses, and John. Then they did a second leg of it, and John was on both. He was the only one on both. He was. That made him famous. So when, about a year and a half later, I see him in a little church, I knew immediately, wow, this is John Lewis. And interestingly, I think he sought the limelight, and, he knew what he was doing. And he was a farm boy, but he also kind of posed as a farm boy and was often underestimated. But so that was the freedom rides. But then after this little group, I think they had a few hundred people volunteered and did it. I didn't witness any of that. I think the first ones were the most dangerous, but the whole thing was a kind of horror scene. But I think before the killing of this of Lloyd George, was that his name? The fellow they murdered that sparked the recent uprising. I I saw SNCC as an inspiration for people who are fighting to prevent climate change. It's something I care about, and I'm always going like, why don't they, lie down the street? Why don't they get arrested? But I thought, why aren't people more radical? And I really felt, and I still feel that SNCC was a model of activism that could serve us in climate change, not for me and you, but for young people who I think if anybody's going to do anything, it's going to be them, because SNCC was a very small group. It had no money. Part of its philosophy was, if we go into the worst areas, which were the most dangerous, and we get publicity and accomplish something there, the rest will all collapse. And that's exactly what happened. And that's exactly what they did.
So you said your father was an accomplished photographer. Did he influence you to your curiosity and interest in photography? And when did you realize what a powerful tool photography could be in shaping your life and your interaction with society at large?
Well, I think there were, I was just reading about it. So yeah, he was a really good amateur photographer, and he made films. And for those people who bother to look at my films, there's a series of films. One's called Childhood, one called Born to Film, and one's called Two Fathers. And he's a big character in all these films. And those are the films about my own childhood, about my son. They're very personal. They use family albums. But Childhood is made entirely from footage he shot starting in World War II. He shot great. He was stationed out in Utah. We lived out in Perry. And so he was really into photography. He was very good at it. He kept albums. So of course that affected me. But in addition, when I was 17, I had saved up some money, and my brother and I, my brother's old, we made a trip to Europe. That was the big trip. My parents were Europeans, so they encouraged us to go to Europe. He told me what kind of camera to get and everything. So he must have looked it up and read magazines, and he told me to get a $60 reflex camera made in East Germany called the EXA. And I went and bought at a camera shop. I bought the camera. And it's a single lens reflex is a Pentax or Nikon F. I mean, those are the serious ones. It's where you look through a mirror, and it's a great way to make pictures. And this had only 4 f-stops and had no prism, so everything was upside down backwards. But it was, a fine German instrument when the Germans made the best cameras. And this is pretty amazing. So I get my first camera, first roll of film. We get on a bus and we go to Dachau. And because Dachau is a suburb of Munich, and Hitler that was the base of his, people loved Hitler in Munich. It was the birth of the Nazi Party. And when he achieved power, he made his first concentration camp. He put it right outside of, it was a munitions factory. And in 1955, they made it the first exhibit in Germany of a Nazi site. And so we visited it, but think of this was only 14 years after there were real people in there. And I was only 17, and we go through the door, and they had a big sign, they had a tree, and it said in German and English, this is where they shot people. I was horrified. I mean, I was literally terrified of the whole thing. But I took a picture of it, and they had pictures of ovens, and they were open. You could see ashes and stuff in it. And I'm going, oh, my God, this is horrible. So some of the very first pictures I ever made were in a concentration camp.
Fascinating. Yeah, the first camp I visited was Dachau as well, much later in the 80s. But what struck me, I'll never forget, is because it is in a suburb of Munich, there were young school children riding their bikes to school that had to go back and forth in front of the memorial on a daily basis, right? reminded of their heritage in that regard. Did your father ever, did he survive to see your success as a photographer, and how did he relate to the work you were doing?
My parents died young, but I mean, they got to see what I had done because I did it so early. I was only 20 when I joined SNCC. I was 22 when I left. And by the time I'd finished all the things that would get well known in photography, it was, I think, I don't know, like 68 or 60. I was 27 years old and I stopped. And so all those books, even though they were remaindered, my parents got to see all of them. They even got to see some of my early films. So that was, and when my mother died, my sales plummeted. Could she call up like a bookstore and say, how come you don't have my son's book? What's the matter with you? You know? And they buy 10 copies. Okay, Mrs. Lyon, we'll buy 10 copies.
There are agents, and then there's mothers, right?
Right.
I was really struck watching the interview with you and John at the Whitney 2016, how emphatic John was about the value of your work in relation to the success of the civil rights movement. I mean, he sincerely credited you in a very significant way. And I mean, that's an extraordinary compliment, which you seemed a little uneasy to accept.
I mean, you know, he was, I miss John. You know, I don't want to get weepy. He was a remarkable person. He was also very modest. And, you know, someone who knew him better than I said, well, you know what he really was? John was he was a farm boy, you know, and that was his background. I mean, my father had this German education. My mother was not it. My mother was self-educated. John was not a college graduate when I knew him. He graduated later after, you know, kind of after the movement. He went back to school and got more degrees. But because we kept in touch when he was in Congress, Nancy and I visited, and we brought 4 children with us, some of whom were teenagers and some of whom were very young, like 8 years old. And we went into his office, and right when you walked in, there was this poster showing John praying the 2 other guys, and it says, "Come, let us build a new world together." And that's the picture I took when I was 20 and he was 22. I mean, we didn't really know each other. And he points to the poster and he says, "Your daddy made me famous," which was a really nice thing to say, but it's absurd. I mean, John Lewis was bound for glory and everybody knew it. And I think what's nice is that because of the relationship he talks to me, and in 1989, there's a book that's still out there, but it's called Memories of the Southern Civil Rights Movement. It's still, I'm the author, it's still in print, and it's Twin Palms Press, and I urge you to buy it. But anyway, that book has all of these pictures, and when I did it, I went around tape recorded my friends, again, Dottie, Julie, and John Lewis. And those tapes became valuable as audio because it's already been 30 years since they were done. And those are all used in the film. Of course, the most amazing scene is the last scene. So I was going to say, so there were really 2 films going on. One, I'm making a film about John Lewis because he's my friend and he's John Lewis. And being with John Lewis is kind of like being, well, I'm going to go have tea with Madonna. And of course, you never get to have tea with Madonna because nobody cares about you and everybody's just, can I take a picture with Madonna? You mind if I take a picture with Madonna? Would you get out of the way? You're with Madonna. We want to meet Madonna. And that's what John was like. You know, people wanted to touch him, to be near him. And it was hard to do anything in public with John Lewis, anything at all. He would be mobbed by people.
Where do you
anyway,
think
that was one film? Go ahead.
I was wondering, where do you think that core clarity, conviction, and optimism came from? Because he had that, unlike most people. I think that's what kept him going and why he became so accomplished.
I think I think John is a mystery. I mean, I think we all are mysteries. You know, great people are great mysteries. I think John, very, very young. I mean, I can't speak for John Lewis. I know nothing about being a young Black person whose father says, okay, now you can put the book down, go out, we're all going to chop cotton, we're all going to pick peanuts. And he said, well, Pop, it's 110 degrees out. He said, well, just get out there and do it, you know. And John said to me, he just hated this. He absolutely hated it. But that was how he grew up. He was born in a house without electricity. So was my mother. Only my mother was in Tsarist Russia. This guy was in the United States of America, born 2 years before me, in a state. Alabama is a state, isn't it? But he was in the Black Belt of Alabama. You know, this is what was left of slavery. It kind of serfdom, and that was his life. I think he saw himself as a liberator, like Moses. You know, that he had these capabilities, and he was going to do it, even if it cost him his life, which he really did expect to die on many of these occasions, not just in Selma, but long before Selma. At the very beginning, they started doing, you know, the civil rights movement grew out of certain cities, which were like hotspots. And think of it as a virus. So it grew in these places and then later spread to many, many places. But at first, it wasn't like that at all. And one of those places was Nashville. And that's where these students were. And John was one of them. Diane was one of them. Bevel, there were a whole bunch of them all together in Nashville. And they created, they had this famous, brilliant teacher, Lawson, who's still alive. And he taught them about Thoreau and nonviolence and Gandhi, and they went for it. Anyway, they early on, they went into I think a Woolworths, and they locked them in, and they started smelling this stuff. And John said, they're going to gas us. And they started putting, you know, smoke in the room. He thought that they were going to die right there. That they were just gassing. And that was very, very early. And of course, Selma is the infamous place, but he was beaten so many times, just terribly, physically, that he would, like Christ, you know, he's putting his body there and said, do whatever you want to me. And I'm here for a reason. And they wouldn't even, in the film, he says, oh, well, we're not going to press charges.
I feel like you're slightly eschewing my questions about the purpose and nature of photography in relation to history and society and culture. So I have a loaded question for you. What is the relationship between photography and history and between art and social justice?
Well, you know, again, things change over time. I do Instagram. I like it. I have 12,000 followers. They sell books and make $20. But that's the world we're in now. But so I grow up and I see Life magazine. We have a subscription. Many middle-class people did. You know, people joke about the magazines you read in doctors' offices like Smithsonian. Anyway, photography was really a big deal. Gene Smith, there was a show at MoMA. My father comes, said, you got to see this show. It was The Family of Man that Steichen did. Most photographers hated the Family of Man show. My father came home and said, you got to see this, this is incredible. And I wouldn't go see it. You know, I was whatever I was. I said, who cares about that? So I was like avant-garde and cutting edge, and I had a different vision. But as I became politicized at the University of Chicago, where people like Bernie were talking about revolution and socialism, I realized Life magazine was full of lies, that it was projecting America that wasn't real. And of course, as we watch films now, we look at these films and we go like, we're the Black people. How come there aren't any dark people? There are no Black people in the films. There are no dark people. There's nothing but these white people killing each other and murdering each other and doing burglaries and car chases. And it's unbelievable almost. nevertheless, that was the world that existed. Segregation was legal. So I, in 13 states, everybody thought that's fine, you know? And so I get very politicized, and I hated Life magazine, but I love photography. And I thought, well, there's a more powerful way to use this, and I'll do it my way, and I'll show them, and then everybody will follow me, and I'll destroy Life magazine. I made the bike riders, and it took 4 years, and it's still in, you know, it was remaindered. You could buy it for 10 cents. And in that sense, it was a failure, but it's been reprinted 4 times. And it became very, very influential, as did a number of these books that I did, which were failures at the time. So I did have my own vision of using photographs to affect people, change people's, make them think and feel. I think the greatest thing that I was trying to do in my photographs, but also in my films. There's a film called The Abandoned Children, which is about children. And you're going to find this fun. I was trying to humanize people. In other words, I saw American people as a kind of robots without feelings. And I'm saying, well, that's not right. I mean, that's not what a human is. That's not how I am. We're full of feelings. And I thought and I blamed the media for a lot of this. The word the media did not exist. No one said media in 1965 ever, anywhere. I don't know when they started it, but they just didn't. The news was 10 minutes, 15 minutes long. There were 4 channels. And I wanted to humanize people through my work. And I knew the challenge was to make my work as human as possible. That's why you like these pictures of all these little kids. There's something very endearing. They're just pictures. They're not even good photographs. They're ordinary pictures of ordinary kids, but you really sense their humanity. And that is, of course, it's the opposite of any kind of racist idea of anything. But it's not just about racism. It's about all of it, about white people being humanized. You know, James Baldwin used to say, there's no black problem in America. It's a white problem, he used to say.
What
But
makes,
I don't think it's just white. It's a whole consumer world that we're in, and how I mean, look at how people function now. What a herd mentality exists, and how easy it is to manipulate.
what makes a good photograph? What do you consider a good photograph?
A good one? You mean the one that makes the most money when I sign it?
Is that,
That's a terrible question, Josh. Come on.
well, you keep saying it wasn't even a good
I'll tell
photograph.
you, I asked that of Hugh Edwards. And so Hugh Edwards is also an unknown figure, but I write a lot. I have a blog. I urge you should mention the blog during the show, and I urge people to go to it. And I put a lot on the blog that isn't written about. And Hugh Edwards is one of the things I write about. So he was the curator of photography at the Art Institute. He discovers me. He was also on crutches, interestingly, and was from Paducah, Kentucky. And he discovered Robert Frank. He discovered me. He gave all these wonderful photographers their first shows. It was the preeminent curator of photography at the second half of the 20th century. And I asked him that question. I said, how do you know, how do you pick the pictures? And he gave an amazing answer. He said, whatever makes me feel good and glad to be alive is what I like. So that's the answer. You know, it's really in the viewer to decide that, not me.
I share your concern about climate change and the importance of raising consciousness about preserving the environment. Has your photography addressed that topic, and what kind of images you think could be useful in that regard?
So, you know, I have this place in New Mexico, and we were away, but we returned to live here full time about 10 years ago. And right about that time, a fire broke out. You could see from the house, called the Conscious Fire. And it burned 200,000 acres, and it burned all summer. And I wrote a book called Burn Zone, which deals with that. But I think the only way, Jane Fonda talked about it. She said that she came up with a number like that 10% of the voters or something. If the people who really feel strongly about this would just get together and go on strike, or just hold hands and sit down in the middle of the intersection in the middle of town, they would bring this country to a halt. I mean, the earth is being destroyed, and we're all contributing to it with our tax dollars. We think Hitler was bad. I have 4 children. I get angry at my son because he'd have a T-shirt and say something that Bush was worse than Hitler. And of course, you can't say that to Jewish people. But the truth is, what we're doing is, Hitler did what he did. We're destroying life on the planet. There's a real potential of ending civilization. Not, Jewish civilization or American civilization, but all civilization. And that's happening right now. And it's like the little girl says, it's criminal. I should know her name, this Swedish girl. It's literally criminal that they're preoccupied with the level of taxes and all these things they're doing. It's almost beyond belief. I used to ask my friend DeSuvero, the sculptor, what it was like during the Holocaust. How could people go around in New York in 1944, California, when this was going on? And he said, oh, because I didn't understand it. I wasn't alive. I was a 2-year-old. And he said, oh, they were all making a lot of money. Meaning they were making a lot of money. World War II was going on. Things were hopping. You could buy stockings, cars. And in a way, that's going on now. It's mind-boggling. But yeah. I'm a radical. I'm proud of it. And I believe that radical direct action works. I think people in the streets are what ultimately are going to create any progressive event in the United States.
Yeah, I've been told that we're just still too comfortable. That we're not squeezed enough to take the environment seriously yet. But there are hopes. We have a new Secretary of the Interior from New Mexico, which I think is
right. She's a Jemez Laguna Indian native. They said it's local news. I think that's the reason the governor didn't get on our governor is Chicana. She wanted to be in the cabinet, but there's no way they'd pick 2 people from New Mexico. Yeah, the Jemez Pueblos. I know all these places that are close by. They said she was homeless at some point, and she was a single parent. Well.
I just think symbolically, it's a pretty significant appointment, in my estimation.
Yeah, we got a lot of great symbolic things going on. We need more wind turbines, less automobiles.
Danny, we've been talking for an hour, so I think it's time to wind it up. I want to give you a chance to share any last thoughts or comments. I'm going to encourage a lot of people to watch your film. I think it's going to be a huge success at many festivals. I'm feel privileged to be one of the initial film festivals to share your achievement. And thank you.
Yeah, I think this is one of the first times it'll be shown. And how does that happen? How many people will? It's done for a few days.
Yeah, we're gonna have a little window. The dates are, hold on here. So the 8th through the 12th, people will get, who register will get the password to watch the protected Vimeo link. During that time, our interview, which is pre-recorded, will be also available to those people who register. And then how will people who get excited about sharing it with others know when the next opportunity will be? to watch it in the future?
I don't know. I think it's gonna, right now, the plan is, there's a 5-minute version on Vimeo. The plan is to get it into a festival, so.
Yeah.
I hope from there it'll end up being streaming. Like I said, if I ran Netflix, you'd
Yeah,
be seeing it right with the,
I would
with all
would
the other
encourage,
stuff.
is it Cody who I've been communicating with, who's helping with the marketing of the distribution?
Well, it's, yeah, Cody.
Who,
Sure. You know, I was going to say I'm a big blogger. It's bleakbeauty.com, bleak, B-L-E-A-K, beauty.com. And I'm at Danny Lyon Photos Instagram, where I post a lot of stuff there, and I love to hear from people via those things.
Yeah, I think we should do a push to all the Jewish film festivals. There are quite a few globally and quite a few in America. And I think in the spirit of Tikkun Olam, healing our world, it would be very appropriate and well supported in that context, as well as festivals in general, of course. But give my best to the land of enchantment. Say hello to my birthplace.
See
Say
you,
hi.
Josh. I hope we meet in Vegas sometime or out there.
Absolutely.
In the desert.
Neil, are you still with us?
The desert
I am, I'm
will
here.
be there.
I'm still recording.
Yeah, I would love to show you the Mojave. So I'm very, very well versed in it. And I know I could take
I
you
love
places
going around the desert.
you'd appreciate. Okay, Neil, wrap
That's
us
what I'm
up.
doing. I'm photographing rocks in the desert. That's what these pictures are. They're all rocks.
That's interesting because I do the same thing. I'll have to share some of mine with you. I'm a
Nothing like
rock
good
rock
old
photographer. I'm a rock photographer. That's how I roll.
roll.
Okay, Neil.
Okay, thanks a lot, Josh.
All right, I am here. Thank you very much, Danny, for your participation. We're thrilled to have you, and we hope we get a lot of folks watching. I just wanted to let everyone know that we will be showing our film for February. Will be available from February 10th through February 17th. It is called Shawn, Passion for Justice. I hope I pronounced that right, Josh. Do you have anything you want to tell us about it?
Well, in the spirit of a lot of what we've been talking about today, Shawn is a very important Jewish artist who was very engaged politically and socially, and bridged the gulf between commercial art and high art. And he's a fascinating, underappreciated, important person that I encourage everybody to learn more about through this film and the special guest that we'll be having in our webinar associated with it. Thanks again very much to Danny and to JCC and Jewish Nevada and all our sponsors and especially all of the people who are joining us to participate. Take care now.
Bye-bye.